Hi, my name is Emily Wines, and to answer your first question, yes, that's really my last name. I'm a Master Sommelier, and I'm the Vice President of Wine and Beverage Experiences for Cooper's Hawk. As a Master Sommelier, I have studied quite a bit about wine and drank my fair share as well. One of the things that I love most about my job is being able to share my passion for wine with people and making it something that's really fun and understandable for them. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about doing today. Learning to talk about wine can be challenging. Without visual clues, it can be really difficult to distinguish what the specific smells are that are even in that glass. Everyone starts out smelling wine and just smelling wine. That's okay. Eventually, over time, you're going to learn how to distinguish whether or not the wine is more earthy or more fruity, and whether those fruits are more like raspberries or blackberries or cherries. And pretty soon, you'll start to develop this language about all of these different flavors that are in the wine, and that's going to help you distinguish what things you like about wine and also help you describe the wine to our guests. When you're tasting wine, you're actually engaging almost all of your senses. You're certainly looking at the wine, you're also feeling the temperature of it when you're drinking it, but most importantly, you're smelling and tasting the wine. In fact, of those two senses, smell is the most important. Most of the things that we think we taste are actually aromas that we're smelling as we're drinking it. When you're tasting wine, there are 3 important steps to go through. You're going to swirl and smell and taste. The first step is swirling, and there's a couple ways you can do that. You can swirl the glass in the air, or if you're not comfortable doing that, put it on the table and just draw a little circle with it. When you're swirling the glass like this, what that's doing is releasing the volatile aromatics. It actually allows you to smell more in the wine. Then stick your nose in the glass. You'll notice this wonderful bouquet coming out of the glass, and when you're smelling, you're going to be looking for different aromas related to fruits or herbs or flowers, earthy smells that are associated with oak aging, all of these wonderful descriptors when talking about the wine. The next step is the taste. Now, this is the first wine I've had in my mouth today. There's a lot of acidity that I'm noticing right away. There we go. By tasting it a second time, now what's happened is that my mouth has been adjusted to that amount of acid, and what I'm tasting now is all the wonderful fruits and all the complex flavors that are coming out in this wine. And then finally, the last thing that I'm tasting is the finish. So after I've swallowed the wine, there's these kind of long, lingering flavors that I'm getting at the very end. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the finish in a wine. You know, don't be afraid to spit out your wine. Spitting is something that I use quite a bit when I'm having to taste a lot of wine and I don't want alcohol clouding my judgment. Sometimes for work, I'll taste up to 100 glasses of wine in a day, and I'll tell you, if I wasn't spitting, I wouldn't be standing for very long. The only thing that's in this glass of wine is grape juice, 100% grapes. So why do we use all of these bizarre descriptors to talk about what these wines taste like? Think about it this way. Different grape varieties have different flavor characteristics to them, just like different apples do. Yellow, green, red apples all have different flavors. So using this language of comparison helps us better explain to the guests what to expect in their glass of wine. Because once you start taking these different varietals and couple that with winemaking techniques, you come up with this huge, wonderful range of flavors to talk about. So it's important to paint a picture with words of exactly what they can expect in that glass. So let's start out talking about fruit descriptors in wine. In white wine specifically, it's usually pretty safe to say that wines taste like apple. Why? Because almost all wines have a little bit of an apple-y flavor to them. But like I said before, there's a really big difference between yellow, green, and red apple. They all have really different flavors to them. So go ahead and taste your Sauvignon Blanc. What color apple do you think that tastes like? Green, right? So we've recognized that there's some fresh apple flavors in this wine, but that's not the only kind of apple that's out there, because you can have really tart, underripe apple or very ripe, juicy apple. But what about dried apple, or apples that are a little bit bruised and just starting to age, or apple pie, or apple cider, or apple candy? So think about not just the name of the fruit that you're recognizing, but what's the quality of it? So now we're going to go beyond just simple apples and talk about all of the categories of fruit flavors that you can find in white wines. There are 4 main categories. We have citrus fruits, tree fruits, stone fruits, and tropical fruits. Under citrus fruit, there's a really broad range of flavors here, and almost all white wines have some citrusy component, but there's a big difference between lemon and lime and orange and grapefruit. The next category is tree fruit, and this would include things like apples and pears. But like we already said, with apples, there's a lot of different colors of apple. There's also a lot of different colors of pear. For example, green pear and brown pear taste totally different. The next category of flavors are stone fruits. Stone fruits are basically any fruit that has a pit in the middle. So that would be nectarine, peach, plum, apricot. These are kinds of flavors that are very distinctive, and you don't find them in all wines, but when you do find them, they're pretty delicious. The final category of flavors is tropical fruit, and some of these are very distinctive. For example, pineapple and banana are flavors that you can get on really ripe Chardonnay. Melon is a flavor that we'll put in here. It's not really a tropical fruit, but it kind of doesn't fit anywhere else. There's also things like passion fruit and guava, which sometimes shows up in Sauvignon Blanc. And then the final one is lychee or lychee. And this is a very unique aroma. If you've ever had one, they're very distinctive. And Gewürztraminer is actually a wine that is very distinctive in that it smells like lychee. There's nothing else like it in the world. So now let's start talking about fruit flavors that are found in red wines. Very common descriptor for red wines are that they taste like berries. But like we were saying before, there's a lot of different kind of berries out there. So say you identify raspberries in your wine. Raspberries are very distinctive, but like I said before, it's not just about what do fresh raspberries taste like, but also what do underripe raspberries taste like, something that's very sour and tart. Or is it more like raspberry jam, that really sweet, unctuous, juicy flavor? Or is it maybe more like dried raspberries, like the raspberry fruit leather, or a raspberry tart, or raspberry liqueur? So you can see, even saying something as simple as raspberries, there's a lot of ways that you can expand on your language about wine. So just like we did with the white wines, we're going to expand on the different categories of fruit flavors that you can find in reds. So in the case of red wines, we're going to break this down into colors of fruit, starting with black fruit. So think about all the fruits that are really dark in color. So this would be things like blackberries or black plum or cassis. Cassis is actually currants or black currants. So it's a little tiny fruit that's a very intense flavor, and it's a very traditional descriptor for things like Cabernet, which is exactly what I smell on this Lux Meritage. The next category would be red fruits, and that would be anything from strawberry, raspberry, cranberry, all of those really pretty bright red tart fruits. Those are typically descriptors that you find in things like Pinot Noir. The next category is blue fruit. Blue fruit includes blueberry and boysenberry and pomegranate. So think about all of those really wonderful blue flavors that you get off of those fruits. And then the final category is brown fruit, and this would be more like figs and dates. Our wines don't typically have a lot of those flavors to them. Those are the kinds of flavors that come out more often in aged wines. And you know, it's a funny thing, 95% of all wine that's produced is consumed within 3 days of being purchased. And we know our guests and we aim to please, so we typically make our wines in a style that's meant to be drank right away. So now we're going to get into some of the more complex aromas that can be found in wine. And you're going to be wanting to smell along with me as we go through this. So the first category would be herbs. There's lots of herbal flavors that you can find in wine. Things like bay leaf or sage. Those are very herbal flavors that can be found in Grenache and Syrah, for example. Grass is another one that we put in that herbal category. So your Sauvignon Blanc here has this really wonderful sort of grassy green aroma to it. Then there are other herbs that you can find, things like peppercorn or tea. These are all flavors that are really complex that can be found in wine. Floral aromas, when you find them in wine, are usually something that's just inherent to the grape variety that they're made from. Some grape varieties, like Muscat, is extremely perfumey. It smells like orange blossoms. You can also find floral smells in things like Pinot Noir, where it's more like roses, or in Syrah, where it smells like violets. Typically, more of the floral aromas are found in white wines, however. So smell these two white wines here, between the Sauvignon Blanc and the Gewürztraminer. Which one's more perfumed? The Gewürztraminer. Do you see how perfumey that is? It smells like roses. Sometimes you can actually find sort of vegetable aromas in wines, and these kind of green vegetable flavors are very distinctive. One of the most distinctive ones out there is green bell pepper. And just to get a little geeky on you, that is actually a chemical compound in the wine that's called pyrazines. It's a chemical compound that is only found in grapes that are in the Sauvignon family. So both Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Sauvignon have pyrazines in them. But you only taste it when the wine isn't very ripe. So our Sauvignon Blanc here is made in a style that is very green and very fresh, and you can get a little bit of that pyrazine aroma in there. Smell it again, you'll see it's a little bit like green bell peppers, very fresh and green tasting. Now, our Lux Meritage is a blend that does include Cabernet Sauvignon. However, in this wine, the grapes are so ripe, so really all you're tasting is that luscious, jammy black fruit flavor and not a whole lot of those green pyrazine flavors. There's lots of other flavors you can find in wines too, things like olive and radish and asparagus. For that matter, the whole world of descriptors is open to you. So if you find something distinctive in the wine, make sure you call it out. Not all wines have earthy aromas. In some cases, wines are really much more dominated by fruit and oak flavors than they are by earthy ones. And that's really the case for most of our wines at Cooper's Hawk. You will find more earthy wines coming out of the old world, so that would be European wines where you'll find that. In the case of our wines, there are some earth aromas you can find, however. We do put these into two different categories. First would be organic earth smells. So this would be things like truffle or mushroom or potting soil, or the way that it smells when you're kicking up the underbrush in the woods, or something like leather. And that's an aroma I actually get off of our Barbera. Then there are inorganic earth smells. So these are things that quite literally smell like rocks or minerals. So if you smell something that's like chalk or dust in a wine, that would be an inorganic earth smell. And sometimes it's just very subtle. Like in the case of our Sauvignon Blanc, it's almost like what it smells like after it rains and the sidewalk gets wet. Not all wines have oak flavors, simply due to the fact that not all wines are aged in oak. Using oak is also a little bit like cooking for a winemaker. The more oak they use, or the newer oak they use, the more extreme oak flavor you get. If you're using older or many times used barrels, you'll have a much more subtle oak flavor. Are any of you here bourbon fans? I know I am. You know, bourbon has been aged in brand new American oak barrels that have been charred on the inside. It's really the most extreme oak aroma that you can find in any beverage. Wine doesn't usually have that much oak treatment to it, otherwise it would really overwhelm the flavors of the fruit. But there are a lot of other oak flavors that you can find in wines, things like vanilla and baking spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, toast, caramel, all of these things that can be found. And we'll have more lessons on the oak coming up later on. There are also a lot of other unique flavors that can be found in wines too, things like cocoa and coffee, cedar and tobacco. Don't be afraid to call out something that you find, and remember, the flavor and the aromas come from the grapes and the winemaking process. We don't actually put coffee, cedar, or tobacco in our wines. So flavors and aromas are just one way of describing what's going on in each of these wines. The next thing to talk about is the structure. And this gets a little bit more complex. For one reason, structure is something that can only be determined by actually tasting the wine. So these are the components like sweetness and alcohol, body, acid, tannin. And also these are the components that typically are what people do or don't like in wines. They might not like a wine that has too much tannin, or that's too dry, or that's too sweet, or too acidic. So understanding all of these structural components in the wine will best help you steer a guest towards a wine that they're going to most enjoy. Acid is what keeps wines tasting fresh. And so when we're talking about the acidity in the wines, this is a really important thing. And even when we're talking about low acid wines, there's still a good amount of mouth-watering that's going on with these. And acid is also important because it's what keeps wines refreshing while you're eating. You want to have a lot of acidity that makes your mouth water so you're ready for that next bite. Think of these levels as low, refreshing, slightly tart, tart, and face puckering, like biting into a fresh lemon. Rob, our winemaker, loves to make wines with very bright acidity, so most of our wines range from refreshing to tart. Language is really important when it comes to talking about wines. As you're describing them to a guest, you want to be very honest about what those wines taste like, but at the same time using really positive sounding words when discussing the wine. For example, the Sauvignon Blanc has a lot of acidity to it, and you could describe that as being sour. That's not really that positive sounding. Instead, use a word like tart. That sounds delicious. You're not hiding anything about the wine, you're just describing it in a yummy way. So when we're talking about sweetness in wine, it's really critical to be very specific about exactly how sweet the wine is. There are many different levels of sweetness, and sweetness comes from residual sugar. What that means is that when wines are being fermented, in some cases, not all of the sugars that are naturally found in those fresh grapes are fermented out. And in the case of wine, you can make a completely bone-dry wine. That would be something about as sweet as a lime, not sweet at all. And in this case, every last bit of sugar has been fermented out of the wine, leaving it completely dry. The next level up is what we'll call dry. And this is a little bit tricky because technically when you're tasting the wines, they are dry. But if you leave a little bit of sugar in those wines, what happens is that sugar actually acts almost the way that salt does on your food. It amplifies the flavors of the fruits in the wine. I would compare dry wine to something like grapefruit. So in grapefruit, you do have a little tiny bit of sweetness to it. It's not bone dry, but nobody would ever call grapefruit sweet. So the next level up would be sort of off-dry or semi-sweet. And in this case, we're going to compare that to a Granny Smith apple. There's absolutely some sweetness in that apple, but at the same time, you get a lot of that really zesty, bright, fresh fruit as well. From there, we go to sweet wines. And in this case, I would compare that to a canned peach. Really lusciously sweet. Not quite to the candy level, but again, quite a bit of sugar here, very fruity, very luscious, versus a wine that's very sweet will be more like caramel. There's no comparing this to any of the other fruits that we would describe. This is very, very, very sweet. So this would be a dessert level wine. The body of the wine refers to the overall richness and texture and mouthfeel of the wine. So in this case, we're talking about wines that range from very light in body to very full bodied. And when talking about this weight in the wine, I like to use a language of comparison. So think about it this way. A wine that is very light bodied might be sort of like non-fat milk, versus a wine that is light bodied would be more like 2%. Medium-bodied would be more comparable to whole milk, whereas a full-bodied wine would be more like half and half, and a very full-bodied wine would be more like heavy cream. The body of the wine is affected by a couple of things. One of them is ripeness, and the other is alcohol, and we'll talk about alcohol next. Ethanol alcohol is produced when the sugars that are found in grapes are fermented, and alcohol adds both texture and body to the wine. We can actually be pretty scientific about this. A very low alcohol wine is less than 10% alcohol. Low alcohol is between 11 and 13%, medium between 13 and 14%, and high alcohol is between 14 and 15% alcohol. Very high alcohol wines are typically fortified with the addition of more alcohol. Cooper's Hawk's Nightjar is an example of this style. Understanding these alcohol levels is not just important for being able to discuss the structure in the wines, but it's also an important component of responsible alcohol service in our restaurants. Tannin is a really important component when talking about red wines. We don't talk about tannins with white wines because white wines don't have them. The reason is that the tannins are coming from the skins of the grape. So think about it this way. Have you ever had a bite of a plum where you notice as you're chewing on it, you get all that sweet, fresh juiciness of the flesh of the plum, but then once you start chewing on the skin, it's giving you a lot of really intense flavor and also the texture of those tannins. This is also happening with grapes. So when wines are being made, in the case of white wine, we're not using the skins, so there are no tannins in whites. But with reds, you will find tannins because the skins need to be soaked with that grape juice in order to extract all of the color and the tannin. If you've ever soaked a tea bag for too long and it's gotten really astringent, you know exactly what tannins are. Tannins are very grippy, they're mouth drying. You can also find them in things like spinach and nuts. So when you're tasting your wine, you're going to rate your tannins from none to low, medium, grippy, and high. Grippy is a common term used to describe a wine that's got a good amount of tannins. And this refers to the way it feels when you rub your tongue against the roof of your mouth and you feel that little bit of a grip that comes from the tannins. So beyond the flavors that we can picture and describe, and also the structural elements that we just broke down, it's important to use really positive sounding words to describe these wines. I like to attribute personalities or traits to them that really sum up what this wine's all about. Again, make sure you're using positive language that sounds enticing and engages the guest to want to explore more. For Sauvignon Blanc, you could describe that as light, crisp, bright, clean, or fresh. Words like floral, perfumed, pretty, and feminine could all be used to describe Gewürztraminer. What wine could be described as buttery, creamy, soft, lush, and rich? Chardonnay. Words to describe a very fruity wine: luscious, juicy, or candied. Words like earthy, rustic, spicy, and smoky, and toasty, those certainly paint a picture. Some of my favorite words are silky, elegant, velvety, plush. These words don't really mean that much, but they're just so darn sexy. I want to drink an elegant, silky wine right now. Rich and bold and powerful, intense, those are all really great words to describe big reds, as are words like dark, brooding, dense, and masculine. Do you see what I mean about using positive words to describe these wines? I think the most important word you can use to describe any of these is delicious. Okay, now it's time for you to put together everything that you've learned today about tasting wine. You understand now how to describe all of the flavors and aromas that are found in the wines, discuss the structure of each of them, as well as using language that is exciting and entertaining and engaging with our guests and keeps them coming back for more. So have fun putting these together, and thank you for tasting with me.